Good morning. Welcome to the Millyard Museum. It's a pleasure to have you all here. It's nice to see such a great crowd. It's always good to have to put out some more chairs. So thank you all for coming here on this nice holiday weekend. Beautiful weather outside. It's my pleasure my name is Jeff Barraclough. I'm the Executive Director of the Manchester Historic Association and the Millyard Museum. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to a revolutionary approach to the study of history of Manchester, the Hareven-Langenbach Amoskeag Project in the 1970s. And the idea behind this talk that Bob will be giving is in conjunction with our new exhibit that we opened last month, Amoskeag Revisited. And just a little bit of background, the idea for that exhibit came twofold. One, it was the 50th anniversary of the exhibit that opened at the Carrier Gallery of Art in 1975 that really helped change people's perspectives of Amoskeag and the Millyard. And we also received a very large donation of photographs of negatives that Randolph Langenbach, the curator of that 1975 exhibit, took during the beginning of the late 1960s of the Millyard, of the before urban renewal began and then while urban renewal was happening. So we had this amazing collection of photographs, and we wanted to showcase that and really honor the work that Randolph Langenbach had done for Manchester. Bob Perreault, who I'll be introducing in a moment, I know many of you know him. He's a real expert on Manchester history, specifically Franco-American history in Manchester. And he worked with Randolph Langenbach and Tamara Hareven on their oral history project, which he'll be speaking about today. And he spoke at the exhibit opening and spoke about his role there. But there was much more to say, so we wanted to have a full opportunity for him to talk about what was going on in that Amoskeag project that he worked on with Tamara Hareven and Randolph Langenbach. So before I call Bob up, I just have a few things to announce, some other events that will be upcoming that I hope you'll avail yourselves of. First of all, I hope you all have a chance to visit the exhibit. I know some of you were in there early, but please check out the exhibit before you leave here today. I would also direct your attention to ladies who are working on a tapestry in the middle of the gallery right out here. This is part of the America's Tapestry project that is being put together for the America 250th celebration beginning next year. They are producing the New Hampshire panel of America's Tapestry, which will eventually have 13 panels, one for each of the original colonies. And once they are all finished, they will be going around the country on display. And so we are hosting the creation of the New Hampshire panel here at the Millyard Museum from now until April, when it will be finished. So they are working on it. They're working on it here every week, every Friday and Saturday. So you feel free to stop and watch, see what they're doing, and speak to the ladies about the design of the tapestry and some of the interesting components that they're putting into it. We also have coming up next month on November 15th a lecture, The Bricks That Built Amoskeag and Beyond. That will be by our trustee, Jeff Murdoch. And then we have our holiday open house coming up on Saturday, December 6th. And will be fun activities for the whole family. Santa Claus will be here, and we'll be having an American Girl tea party for some our young people. So please, hope you can come and join us then. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Bob Perreault to come up and speak about this project. And thank you, Bob, for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. Well, I am thrilled to see all these people. I never expected so many people to come, because this talk is not about the Amoskeag. That's always attracts a lot of people. This is about the backstory of the Amoskeag Project. So we're going to be talking about research methods and that sort of thing. And there will be 2 slides that you're going to see. So this is not a slideshow. This is not my regular humanities talk, which has about 70 slides or something like that. So you're going to learn about the background behind this book and how it was made. How many people have read this book? So a few of you. Now I recommend that those who haven't read it go in the gift shop out there and help a nonprofit organization by buying this book because it's still available and reading it. But anyway. So, so I call this a revolutionary approach to the study of Manchester history, the Hareven-Langenbach Project, and that's because traditionally, and I think most people here will agree with me, traditionally history was taught in school about important people, important events, important movements, politics, wars, inventions, and that kind of stuff. And when I was a kid going to school, if you had said to me, someday you're going to be studying and writing about history and all that, I'd have said, no, I don't think so. This is boring, learning all these dates and names and this and that. But then along comes this new thing called the new social history. And actually, this is about everyday life, everyday people and their culture, what they were all about, and their life and work and that sort of thing. And believe it or not, this goes back to the Depression. The WPA, Works Project Administration, sent out people to interview ordinary people to talk about their lives and that sort of thing. Well, now let's fast forward to the Amoskeag Project in the 1970s. First of all, the authors of this book, Randolph Langenbach was one of them. Langenbach used to go skiing up in the mountains, and he'd go by on Route 93 over here, the Everett Turnpike, and of course you get the whole, from that perspective, you get the view, the long view of the Millyard, and it's pretty impressive to go from one end to the other. And he was really impressed with that and decided he was interested in architectural history, and so he went to Harvard and studied architectural history, and he decided to use Amoskeag, the Amoskeag Millyard, as his topic, his subject. And so he came out at that time with an article which became famous about the Amoskeag Millyard. It was in the Harvard Alumni Bulletin in 1968. And he put this out with his photographs. He's also a photographer. And I don't have to show you all this because those photographs are all in that exhibit. And he also interviewed a lady that you will see in the exhibit, Mary Cunian. Mary Cunian had an aunt who was an expert weaver who was recruited by the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company from Scotland to come over here and work. And then the aunt recruited her niece, Mary Cunian, to come over she was a teenager. So she came over here in 1900 and had lived in the corporation housing, the same corporation housing as her aunt, from 1900, and in 1969 she was still living in that corporation housing, and Langenbach interviewed her and photographed her, so you can see her photograph there. And then she died. And at the same time, as Langenbach is trying to help preserve this, because he's saying this Millyard is so unique. It's not like other Millyards in other places. You know, you go to places like Lowell and others that were mill towns, but you know, you got a few mills here, a few mills there, but here it's all in one place, all along the river. It was really, really unique. And so he eventually met up with this woman named Tamara Hareven, professor at Clark University, who happened to be studying, she was involved in family and work and the relationship between family and work and immigration and how all of these things interacted with each other. And so she decided she wanted to do something about the Amoskeag workers. And so the two of them eventually got together and decided to start a project called the Amoskeag Project. And of course, as I said, we're going back to this new social history. This is what she was into, and so she wanted to be interviewing people who worked in the Amoskeag mills. Now, the Amoskeag mills closed in 1936, which means that in the 1970s, anyone who worked in the Amoskeag mills had not worked there since 1936. So we're talking about people, you know, and senior citizens, obviously. So, also because this Mary Coonian had died, that's one thing, but then at the same time, as Jeff mentioned before, urban renewal was coming to Manchester, and they were tearing down mills right and left. So he's thinking, wow, these people of that age who worked in those mills are dying, and now they're tearing down the mills. We've got to do something to try to preserve what's left. Now, at the time, we weren't sure that all of these mills, in fact, the one we're in now, it's still here, and they tore down between a third and a half of the mills. And so at the time, they thought, well, if they tear them all down, that's a whole part of Manchester history, and American history, if you want, that's going to disappear. We've got to do something to document it. And so that's why they created the Amoskeag Project. Now, the project itself was housed in what was then the Manchester Historic Association's only building, the one up on Amherst Street, Amherst and Pine, just opposite, diagonally opposite the city library. And they have in their library Amoskeag records, including the between 68,000 and 75,000 individual employee files of the workers starting in 1911. Prior to that, now Amoskeag had been around since the 1830s, but they had not kept records like this. But what was happening is, see, they had many different mills, and people would come to work. They'd go to a particular mill and ask for a job, and sometimes it worked out, and sometimes it didn't. And what would happen is bosses from the different mills, because it's all the same company, Amoskeag Company, would talk to each other sometimes, and one would say, oh, I had this guy that I had to fire him because he was stealing cloth or stealing tools, or he was incompetent or whatever. What was his name? One give his name to this other guy, and the other boss said, geez, I just hired this guy this morning. So Amoskeag decided, we've got to do something about this. And it took till 1911 for them to actually build a building, which is still there on Canal Street. It's the employment office, the Amoskeag Employment Office. So instead of going to an individual boss in a particular building or whatever, you would have to go to that employment office and fill out some forms, and then you take the form to the boss, and then the boss would approve it and the whole thing, so that way they could keep track of their workers. So from 1911 to 1936, there were, as I said, between 68 and 75,000 people who worked there, and those records, individual employee files, are in the library at the Manchester Historic Association's Research Center. And that includes 3 generations, because you figure if you were elderly or about to retire, say in 1911, you'd be there, but then going all the way to 1936, you'd have 2 more generations. So there's really 3 generations of the last 3 generations of people who worked in the mills that we have these files. And if any of you have relatives who worked in those mills in those days, you could look them up. You can actually find their files, hopefully. because it's not always easy. I mean, if your uncle or your great uncle or your great grandfather was named Joseph Smith, you might have trouble, you know. But you got to find out what's what. So I'm going to just show you I said I was going to show you two slides. We're going to turn the lights off for just a couple minutes, and I'm going to show you two slides. Claudette? Claudette is my technical assistant here. So when you first came in, now I apologize for the writing. Unfortunately, the writing on here is not very clear, but I'll tell you pretty much what's what. When somebody would come to work in the mill, they'd have to fill out one of these employment passes, which will give you the department and the overseer, and then, of course, the information about the person. So you got the person's name, the person's address, their what they call their nationality, meaning their ethnic group, their age, their marital status, if they had children, the job that they were going to do, and this and that. So that's pretty much what's what. So we had this file here and this particular person. His name was Adélard Lamy, or in English, Adélard Lamy. I interviewed him. That's why I used this particular file. I don't know if you can read it, but toward the bottom there, it says he's illiterate, which is it's strange because he actually signed it. Usually the illiterate people would just sign with an X. He was able to sign his name. And when I interviewed him, he was living on Kelly Street, and he was in his late 60s, and he admitted to me that he still was illiterate after all those years. So I thought that was kind of interesting, kind of sad actually, but anyway, we could switch to the next slide, please. And when you would leave, then you would get this kind of a slip, which again said what department you worked in, what job you had, and the boss, and also it had your conduct. Now, in this particular case, they did not, for whatever reason, say what his conduct was like and what his work was like and whatever, but they do give the reason he left. And if you look at that, it says work too hard. It says T.O. I mean, he was illiterate, but the boss was sort of not illiterate, but didn't know how to spell. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So every time you would come in for a job, you'd get the first slip, and when you'd leave the job, you'd get the next slip. Now, some people only worked a little bit, and so that's all they'd have. But other people would work through all those years, and they kept changing jobs, so they'd have these thick files, with every time you get a new job, there's a new employment pass. Every time you leave that job, there's also the discharge pass. So we had a real variety of some people, like I said, they just came in, they were there in 1911, they left in 1936, and they never changed jobs, so they'd only have two files. But whatever it is, because like I said, some of them are very thick, but your relatives, if you want to see them, check them out. Go to the research center and give them the name of the person. And you can also tell by, if you happen to know the address of the person and you know the age of the person, that helps too, if two names are the same and whatnot. So anyway, okay, if we can have the lights, the projector off and the lights on, we'll continue. So the idea here was to take these files and reconstruct a person's work record. So Tamara Hareven, who was in charge of that part of it. Langenbach was more, like I said, the architectural historian, so he was a photographer. He was the one photographing the Millyard and that sort of thing. But I worked more for her, actually. Her original research team, it was from St. Anselm College. She recruited students from St. Anselm College to go into these files. And by the way, there were 3,000 of that, the 68 to 75,000, they took a sample of 3,000 of those to really get a good picture of who were these people and what was their work record like and that sort of thing. So the people who were doing this, who were taking down all the data from those files, were St. A students. And in the spring of 1973, she knew that those students were going to be going home eventually in May or June, whenever the semester ended. So she put an ad in the Union Leader. And at the time, I had just graduated the previous year from St. Anselm College, and there's no connection here at all. I saw this ad, and it just said research assistant, and I was a sociology major there, and I thought, well, why don't I just apply for this? Because this was in 1972 when I graduated, there were not a lot of jobs in that field. And so I had worked in the movie theaters in Manchester, and I went back to working there. I had been an usher, but now I was a janitor. So I was cleaning the theaters at night. And in the daytime, I had found this little job working in a daycare center and whatnot. And my mother was saying, he went to college, and now he's mopping up the theater with his diploma. That was what my mother said. So I applied for this job, asking for a research assistant, and that's all it said, research assistant. Apply, and so I get this phone call, please come down to the Manchester Historic Association. So I did, and I had put in my resume, don't ask me why I did this, but I speak French. So I put that down. I thought, well, it can't hurt, right? That was Tamara Hareven interviewed me. She says, oh, you're the guy for the job. You grew up here. You have connections in the French community. And 40% of the workers at Amoskeag were French Canadians, Franco-Americans. So she thought, wow, I've got the guy I want here. Because all those St. A students are going to be leaving to go home. So now she says, now you're going to hire some people for me, So I hired my sister. I hired some friends, and so it was fun. We had a great time. We were working there on a daily basis at the research center, taking down all that information, and she had made up these forms that so we could put down all that information, and they were going to be running these through. This is in the old days with the computer cards and all that, the punch cards and all that sort of thing. But our job was strictly to record that stuff. So we did this for about a year, and then in January of '74, she said, well, now that we've got that whole sample, what we have to do is a direct city directory trace. And I thought, I knew what a city directory was, but they had a whole collection of these city directories. And they said, now that you've got all this information, you're going to go into the city directories and you're going to trace them, find them in there and trace them. And that wasn't easy either, especially where people had names that were similar and all that. But as best as we could, we tried to match up the names with the addresses. And city directories, if you know what they are, it's got the name of the person, the address. This is anybody over 18, by the way. And it's got their job, okay? Well, when you've got a whole collection of these things, you can look them up year after year after year, and you can see them change address. And sometimes the only way you can tell is if they've got, husband and wife together. So if it's the same spouses, well, it's the same people. Sometimes we're never sure. And sometimes there are mistakes, especially with immigrant groups, spelling of names. I mean, Polish names, Greek names, French names. At least I knew some variations on French names, but I did not know the Greeks and the Polish and whatever. But we tried the best we could to trace them into as modern times as we could. And so at some point, we were able to finish that, and we realized that there were very few people who went all the way to today being in the 1974. But we try to call them up, find them in the phone book, and call them up and see if they would like to be interviewed. And that was a strange sort of thing too, because imagine you get a phone call from somebody, hello, my name is Robert Perreault and I work for I'm working at the Manchester Historic Association on this project about the mills. And we realized that you worked in the Amoskeag mills. And they're like, what are you, the FBI? Or how do you know? Well, we have your record, your work record. What? Work record? What are you talking about? And then once if you get that far into the conversation, they haven't hung up on you or whatever, they'd say things like, well, wait a minute now, you're doing a research project, but all I did was work in mills. I never did anything important, or my job, I'm just a regular person and blah, 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 blah. I'm not a president, or I never, was a hero in a war, or I never did this or that. So they were really, really surprised that we wanted to interview them. And if we got to interview them and we'd show them their work record, they were like, wow, I didn't know this existed, on me. And sometimes they'd contradict us. Oh, no, I never did that job, or I never did this. Well, it's here in writing, and it's your name, and it's your address, and this is your signature on here, and it got to be pretty interesting. Anyway, also the work records would sometimes, it would jog their memories. It was like things about certain incidents that took place, because we wanted to know, what was your daily life like at home? Those who worked in or lived in corporation housing, what was that like? Those who were in ethnic neighborhoods, what was that like? What was it like working in the mills and blah, blah, whatever. But one thing we discovered too is, when you're looking back in the old days and you're 70-something or 80-something or whatever, you may be looking back with rose-colored glasses, And so people sometimes would talk about, oh, it was wonderful to work in the mills. And I'm thinking, really? Really? Because I know people right now who work in the Chicopee Manufacturing Company, where they're making gauze for the Johnson & Johnson Company, or they're working at Wambeck, or they're working at, and for them it's like, oh, they just can't wait to get out of there, and someday I want to work in some other place or whatever. But these are people who said, I worked there for 40 years or 30 years or whatever, and I loved it, and it was nice. And others, who said, no, it was horrible, it was drudgery and whatever. But what else was there? There was, I unfortunately I didn't have an education, and so I had to work there and whatever. Now, one of the things, as I said, was there were very few people who were still alive, or it's still, that we could contact. So Tamara Hareven decided we should probably try to go beyond the sample, if to get more people. So how would we do that? How would we identify these people? They're not in the sample, whatever. And I said, well, I know one solution. I said, I know we had at the time 8 Franco-American parishes, 4 on the east side, 4 on the west side. I said, how about if I contact them and ask them if they could put in their church bulletin a little ad that just talks about the project, and if anybody worked in the mills, would you please contact us, and we'd like to interview you. And I said, they'll trust us, because if it's in the church bulletin, right? So, and from there we branched out into ethnic organizations and senior citizens. We had at the old what used to be the Warren Motel at one time on Merrimack Street, there was a daily luncheon thing for people. Elderly people would go there. It was the opposite of Meals on Wheels. This is where senior citizens would come and they could eat. And so we had gone there and found tons of people who had worked in the mills, and they were willing to talk. Once they understood what the project was about, they were interested in being interviewed and whatnot. Now, I had no training in this. I mean, now we're getting out of the whole thing of just copying data from the mill records and all that. So Tamara said, well, I will teach you. And I happen to have an aunt, Lillian Perreault, who had worked in the office at Amoskeag. She was never like a real textile worker, but she worked in the office. And so she says, let's go interview her. And she's your aunt, so you'll be comfortable. And she says, I'll pretty much do the interview and show you how, and then you can do it on your own. So that's what we did. And then I was living in an apartment house at the time on Amherst Street, right near the Manchester Historic Association, and I had a lady, there was 12 apartments, and there was a lady downstairs whose mother was living with her, and her name was Jenny Hebert, and she had worked in the mills. So I said, okay, I've got a neighbor here, I can feel comfortable, start with her. So, and it just branched out from there. I interviewed two of the most interesting ones that I interviewed, who ended up in the book, by the way. Henry Carrigan, or Carignan in French, who was a second-hand in the carding, and I interviewed him. He was wonderful. He just really, a lot of good information and that sort of thing. And Antonia Bergeron, who was a room girl in spinning, she was in her 90s when I interviewed her, and the same thing. She was in a nursing home. Mr. Carignan was still living at home with his wife, and she had worked in the mills as well, but she was more, because he was part of the sample, and at the time we were only doing the sample, so I did not interview her, but she gave a lot of good information. And by the way, when I say interview, I mean with a tape recorder. So we had taped interviews. And from there, we networked. In other words, we would ask people, in order to get more people, we'd say, do you know anybody else who worked in the mills? Well, in some cases, in the Henri Carignan family, there was his wife and then two other couples who had also worked in the mills who were Carignans as well. And so I was able, in some families, we did, real networks of families, which was nice, because you'd get all kinds of great stories, sometimes contradicting themselves, from, oh no, don't listen to him, he doesn't know what he's talking about, or that sort of thing. But and then in the middle of all of this, in 1975, February 75, it was announced that the Chicopee Manufacturing Company, the one I said made gauze for Johnson & Johnson, was going to be closing. Now, the Chicopee, those of you who I'm sure most of you know, was on the west side. It became a cable company later. Before that, it was the old Amoskeag Coolidge Mill. We got to visit it a couple of weeks before it closed in February of 75. So I had never been inside a textile mill. I could not believe it. First of all, just outside, you put your hand on the brick wall like this outside, and you could feel it. You could feel it shaking from the machinery. And then we get inside, and they said, now OSHA is going to make you wear earplugs to go in there. Well, I interviewed people who were really, oftentimes very hard of hearing, and come to find out those people, OSHA didn't even exist in those days, and so they were working without that protection of ear plugs. But anyway, we had to wear the earplugs, and they gave us a tour of the whole place, and spinning and weaving and carding and all the other things. So that was really amazing. And what Tamara Hareven and Randolph Langenbach decided to do was, since we had been interviewing people, like I said, who worked at Amoskeag that closed in 1936, now we had mill workers who were working then and there, and their place was going to close. So we started interviewing those people, and those people, some of them were, young, and so you were getting their story as they're working. It's not the rose-colored glasses story, it's the real story. And you'll see pictures of some of those people as well in the exhibit, because Rand-Langenbach decided to photograph them right there in the mill. So that was nice. We had a really, we were very fortunate to have that. And eventually, later that year in '75, that's when we had the famous Amoskeag, A Sense of Place, A Way of Life exhibit, the original exhibit from because what you see here today is a fraction of what was at the Courier Museum. Now, this is interesting because the Courier, people think of the Courier, and in those days it was called, by the way, the Courier Gallery of Art. Today it's the Courier Museum. Most people, I think, in Manchester had probably never set foot in that building. Well, this was the first time and the only time, as far as I know, that they had an exhibit like this with Rand-Langenbach's photographs. And by the way, Langenbach, when they were demolishing mills, he would salvage pieces of mill. And I mean pieces. Machinery, even a stairway. There was a spiral stairway, and some of the gates, those wrought iron gates, and architectural stuff. In fact, the Historic Association still has a lot of that in storage now. And so a lot of this was in the exhibit. There were also tape recordings of some of the people that we had interviewed. This exhibit lasted from September to November of 1975, a very short exhibit. But in that time, just on the opening day, it was said that we had 500 people come through. And on the closing day, they said there were over 1,000 people who went in to the Courier. People who had worked in mills, who had never set foot in the Courier, and who thought, wow, like my life, my work is worthy of being in the Courier Museum. This is amazing. And that really changed people's attitudes toward the Millyard. And I think that's probably why it saved a lot of the buildings here. Unfortunately, they tore down some of the most beautiful buildings that used to line the canals, and they filled the canals, the two canals, but there was, the canals at one point would curve and the mills would follow the curve, and you'll see that in the photographs as well. So that exhibit, I think, really changed people's attitude toward Manchester history. And then, by the way, this was not only going on here, it was going on in a lot of other places. Now, I did, in all, they did a little over 300 people who were interviewed. I did roughly 120 of those interviews, and 50 of those interviews I did in French. And Hareven's team, she had a team down in Massachusetts. I said she was at Clark University. They transcribed all of the interviews, and for the French ones, I had to then translate into English the transcriptions. Now, the transcriptions in English were done exactly as the people had spoken, so that you captured their language, the way they expressed themselves. The only thing they rearranged would be if, like, how sometimes you'll be talking about something and you say so it's a particular thing about how, let's say, you're weaving cloth or something like that, and you're talking about shuttles and whatever, and then you get on to something else, spinning or whatever, and then somebody says something and it's like, oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, blah, 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 blah. Well, they put it in themes, and so that the only changes was to try to make the interview stay on the same subject, from subject to subject to subject, and not, kind of go all over the place. But other than that, the language was the same. So I interviewed, other than the French people, I interviewed Americans, Yankee people, who obviously their language was English, Irish, Greeks, Polish, Scottish, Swedes. Now, in some cases, there were people, because their people are elderly, oftentimes their English was not that good. And some didn't even speak any English at all. Now, Amoskeag had a way of keeping people together. They'd put, in this corner of the spinning room, all Polish people. In this corner, it's all French people. In this corner, it's Greek, whatever. So that people, they'd speak their own language at home, and they speak their language at work. So a lot of people never learned English. So in those cases, I had to contact the children of the workers, and the children would be present at the interview, and then I had to trust, if you can imagine this, I ask your mother or ask your father or your great uncle or whatever it was, blah, 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 and so they'd say it in whatever language, and then they'd respond, and then they'd tell me. So I had to really be trusting. What I do recall at one point was I was interviewing this, it was actually this lady and her husband were housing their two mothers. So you got mothers-in-law, mothers, okay? One was Polish Roman Catholic who belonged to St. Hedwig's, and the other one was Polish National Catholic who belonged to the Holy Trinity Church and these both churches were actually close to each other. Originally, St. Hedwig's used to be over on Merrimack Street, but they rebuilt not far from my parish. My parish was St. George Franco-American Parish. And St. Hedwig's is still there for that matter, and so is the church, the other church, the Polish National Catholic. So I, very naively, because I was only in my early 20s, I said, could you ask them what's the difference between those two and why they belong to the particular one that they do? And the lady said, she looks at me and she says, if I ask that question, I'm going to have to move out of here because that is going to start the biggest feud you ever saw. So I didn't get my answer. I eventually did get my answer, and it's a long story, and I won't even get into that, but whatever. So another controversial topic was the strike of 1922, that the Amoskeag, down south, there were mills as well, and obviously that's where cotton was growing, and the slavery at one time, people relied on that. I don't know how many people who worked in the mills here in the north ever thought about that because Amoskeag did have wool, but it was mostly cotton. What was that like to be working in a place that exploits slavery? Because that's what they did. That's where the cotton came from. But anyway, they were able to produce cloth a lot less expensive down there. So they were competing. The North was trying to compete. And in order to compete with the South to get prices that, were profitable, they would do things like increase work hours while at the same time dropping the salaries of people. So Amoskeag was known as the strikeless company because they had a program of paternalistic services for the people. They had the playground for the children. They had medical and dental for free for people. They had a textile school where you could actually learn a new skill so that you could rise up in the company, that sort of thing. They had a baseball team. They had in fact, they're the ones who built what it was called back then Textile Field. And if you know the stadium, Gill Stadium, that whole thing kind of looks like a mill, the window shapes and all that sort of thing. So this was a way to keep people's loyalty by treating them nicely, and it was really benevolent dictatorship. It was, to try to keep them in line and all that. Well, by 1922, things, especially after the war, after World War I, everything went back up because there's a lot of production during war, so that was okay. But then after the war, it went back to what it used to be, and so Amoskeag decided in February of 22 we're going to reduce wages by 20%, and we're going to up the work week from 48 to 54 hours. And so they said, no, that's not going to work, and we're not going to work. So they went on strike from February 13th, 22, all the way into November. So for 9 months. Now think about this. 17,000 people worked in those mills in a city of close to 80,000. That's a lot of people. If you didn't work in the mills, somebody in your family did, or your neighbors, or you could not be not connected to Amoskeag in some way. It paralyzed the city and whatnot. So, and people were either for the strike or against the strike. And I interviewed some people. I remember one lady in particular who I had asked her, I said, do you have anybody in your family that I could interview besides yourself? And she said, well, I got this, I forget what it was, a sister-in-law or something like that who worked in the mills. But she was against the strike. We haven't spoken since 1922. And this was 1975, 74, 75. They hadn't spoken all those years. And I met several people like that who were divided over the strike. And also, there were two more strikes in 1933 and 34 that were violent. The ones in 22 were not. That strike was never violent, but in 33 and 34, the militia had to be called in to try to keep the peace and whatnot. People sometimes confused the strike, the different strikes, and some even confused the closing in 36. This was the Depression now. The Depression, obviously, things really went bad. And Amoskeag, after the strike of 22, it was never the same. That's one of the things people have said, those who remembered correctly said that, let's say a woman weaver would have 4 looms. Now she had 8 looms, and she wasn't getting any more money or whatever. And they started to downsize and downsize and downsize. I said 17,000 people during the strike. By 1935, in September of 35, they were down to 2,000, from 17,000 to 2,000. That's how bad things were. And by the way, if you hear this myth, they closed the mills on Christmas Eve, it's not true. They closed the mills in September of 35 with 2,000 people working. And in December 24th, they declared bankruptcy. They filed for bankruptcy at that time. So people are confusing that. People were confusing the closing of the mills in 36 with the strike. Oh yeah, the mill, I never worked there. Yeah, your record says, look, your record says you worked there after the strike. So come on, anyway. It's how people remember things sometimes. What happened was in the spring, they tried to reorganize. They were hoping to reorganize so that they could reopen. And instead, what happened? The flood. The flood. One of the worst floods that we had ever had in Manchester occurred that spring. It just so happened that the snowfall that winter was excessive. And then the weather just kind of got, sometimes in as early as February, you can have, really a thaw. And so everything was thawing. And then it rained. and precipitation, which should have been snow, it was rain. And so in March of 36, along the river, all those mills along the river, the first floor, the ground floor, was underwater. So that when the water receded, it left sand and silt in the machinery and this and that. And finally, it was just, the court ordered them to dissolve the company and whatnot. So they rehired a few people for a cleaning crew to come in and kind of just clean up so that they could sell the mills. And they ended up, Amoskeag Industries was a company that was created by former Mayor Perreault here in Manchester with a group of bankers and industrialists and others. They raised $5 million to purchase the entire Millyard and also the dam. So they sold the dam to Public Service Company to generate electricity, and then they resold all the buildings individually to different companies so that one large company could not control the city the way Amoskeag had controlled the city. So anyway, the book, Amoskeag, Life and Work, you have that? Don't read that. I'll tell you why after. This book came out in 1978. Does anyone else have this book? Okay. All right.
It's not the same as the other paperback. It's a different book.
Why do you say it's not the same?
Well, you said not to read that. You said to read that.
Yeah, but why did I say it's... I didn't say why.
No, you didn't say why.
And you don't know why?
No, I haven't finished it yet.
You haven't finished it. When did you buy this edition?
Yes, I have that book. A friend of ours gave it to us
Recently,
in the last couple of years.
and you still haven't finished it.
No.
Okay, well, I'll give you an example. Did you know, according to this book, that St. Augustine's Parish is on the west side?
Oh, geez. Oh, it's very inaccurate.
So I'll just use that example. Now, if you buy this book, which is the paperback edition, and you look at the copyright page, at the very bottom, it says, "We are grateful to Robert Perreault and to Elizabeth Lessard for alerting us to errors in the first edition of this book." So that was just one error, okay? Now, I still love Tamara Hareven, but I'm sorry, she had this attitude that I was just this kid, working for her, and I had a BA in sociology, and I had asked her, I said, could I read the manuscript? Well, she says, I have scholars from Harvard and other places. They're going to do this. Well, do you think the scholars at Harvard knew that St. Augustine Church was on the east side rather than on the west side? So when she had her publication party at the Historic Association, people had bought her book and they had read it and they're lined up. And she thought they wanted her autograph. And they said, on page 129, I never said this, or anyway, whatever. So afterwards, she said, Bob, I need your help. She was, I mean, generally speaking, it's okay. It's just that the devil is in the details, and that's what it was. And I think she realized that she should have let a yokel local like me read it. And Elizabeth Lessard, by the way, anybody who knew Betty Lessard, she was the librarian in the research center, which is now the research center. At the time, that was the museum. Betty Lessard was born in 1922 and she died in 1997. She was a walking encyclopedia on Manchester history. She lived Manchester history, and I respected her, and everybody respects her, those who knew her and worked with her. And so she and I got together, and I typed out, I remember, 4 pages single-spaced of corrections. So they corrected whatever, pretty much what we gave them, except, which I thought was kind of strange, this particular thing, it says right at the top here, reprinted from the Harvard Alumni Bulletin of April 13th, 1968, and in the paperback it says February 68. So there still are some little thingies, but, get the, just go, after this is done, help a nonprofit organization, go in the bookstore, in the gift shop, and buy this book. And it's a lot more accurate. So anyway. And later on, Tamara put out her own book on the mills. This is more like the history of the mills and the history of the workers. And it's accurate. It's very accurate. So, and this book is not as well known, by the way. It's called Family Time and Industrial Time. And so this is the more scholarly book. The other book is the interviews with people. And by the way, even though there were more than 300 people interviewed, only about 40 people's interviews actually showed up in that book for, space reasons and that sort of thing. So, now, if anybody's interested, also, while you're in the gift shop, okay, this is my book on Manchester history as told through postcards. So there's a whole chapter in there of old postcards of Manchester showing the Millyard and the river and the canals and that sort of thing. So if you're interested in that, if you're interested in the Franco-Americans, I have this book as well. So if you want to help the Historic Association, I don't get a lot for this, by the way. I think they sell this for a couple of $22. I think I don't know, even $1 per book. So as royalty, so they're the ones profiting. And if you don't like history, but you want to read a historical novel, this isn't even out yet. It's going to be out officially in November, and I'll be here Christmas for the Christmas open house. I'll be signing books on December 6th. So this is a novel about Franco-Americans. There's a lot of things you can't say in nonfiction, but you can say it in a novel. So anyway, so are there any questions? Or have I answered your questions or whatever? Yes?
You mentioned at one point a third to half of the mill buildings were taken down. Is that nation or New England or Manchester?
No, this is just Manchester. Yeah. Oh, yeah, there are huge. It's hard to believe sometimes when I look at old photographs and show how narrow some of the streets were here. This outside here there was a canal right out here, okay? And another row of buildings besides that. How they squeezed all that in, I don't know, but they did it. So, anything? Yes?
I just wanted to say you did an excellent job, and you were very entertaining as well, and I think the audience always appreciates that. But also I wanted to mention, when you're, besides the exhibit, if you tour the Millyard Museum itself, you'll see a little story about the men that the Amoskeag Industries that recovered and bought everything, raised that $5 million and so forth. And it's fascinating to watch it. It's right on the wall. You just push a button and you can listen to that. I think you would enjoy it.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
Thank you, that was great. Can you tell us again where we can get that paperback?
After this talk, if you go in the gift shop of this museum, you will find this along with my 2 of my books. The novel isn't out yet, so, but whatever. Yes?
All the interview transcripts, are they at the Historic Association, the Research Library?
Jeff, help me on this.
So They are not. We have some of the original tapes, but not all of them. I think some of the tapes don't exist anymore, but we have some of the tapes. Some of them have been transcribed, but not all of them yet.
And the reason for that is because Randolph-Langenbach, who is still alive, by the way, Tamara Hareven died in 2002. Randolph-Langenbach lives in California. And you know what happens in California? Fires. His house burned, and they lost a lot. And that is really sad. But they do have some of the
We
tapes
have some of the
here.
tapes, and we only received them not that long ago they came from Tamara Hareven's estate.
Yeah.
But she didn't have all of them. I think he
Right.
had.
He
half.
had some that,
At least
because I
half
remember
that
there was a
was destroyed.
front page article in the Union Leader about that and how these tapes had been lost and whatnot. Yes,
Just to contribute to that, the University of Delaware, which has her papers, has a significant amount of those tapes, and we've been working together trying to establish the extent or the scope of what their collection has. But they have things I know that the Historic Association doesn't have.
and this
A
guy
lot of
knows,
transcripts.
this guy knows what he's talking about because he is our librarian archivist at St. Anselm College. So he's my friend Keith Chevalier.
So one other thing too, we have a grant that we're working on, our Franco-American collections at the college with the Historic Association, starting a project to digitize the Amoskeag records. So we're just starting out with a small set, and hopefully in future grant opportunities, we'll be able to cover the entirety of the thing. They're super small and super difficult to work through. There's no machine processing. It's all kind of like how you were doing things by hand back in the day.
Yeah. Any other? Yes.
My mother worked in the mills, but later on at the shoe shop. So
Yeah.
it
Which
changed-
one?
Oh, Wambach, JF, Jefferson.
Well, wait a minute, Wambach was textile, Wambach was textiles, JF McKelwin, that was a shoe.
Jefferson?
The Jefferson Mill, that was textiles as
Whatever
well.
ones, but
Yeah.
so the transition from cloth and cotton to shoes.
Right.
So were there not shoe mills in those?
Oh, yes, yeah, and when I said that the Amoskeag Industries, that group that got together and bought the mills and then resold them, they resold them to individual other types of corporations and whatnot. So there were some textile mills that came in, like the Chicopee and Pandora as well. You said Pandora, making the sweaters, and Wambach. But there were other industries, and the shoes were one of them. BB Shoe, Myrna Shoe, and that was a whole different. Oh, by the way, I don't have the book here, but over in the Millyard, in the gift shop, there's a history of the shoe industry in Manchester as well by a lady who now teaches in the UNH building down here, which is across the way, which is the Pandora factory. So you get all these connections. And I wrote the preface to the book, so there's another one. So whatever. So any other? Yes.
These Amoskeag still exist today, and that they own property in Manchester?
Well, through Amoskeag Industries, that still exists in the sense that, for example, Amoskeag had, they dictated pretty much. I mean, it was called the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company, and they did manufacture, obviously, not just textiles, but for a while they made locomotives, and they made steam fire engines, like you'll see in this museum, and they made Springfield rifles during the Civil War and whatever. But Amoskeag they were a land and water power development company. They bought land on both sides of the river pretty far, and so they could dictate what was going to go where, and parks were one of those things. Now, if you wanted to build, like the courthouse in the park at what's now called Veterans Memorial Park. It used to be Merrimack Common. In order to build that, they had to have permission, and sometimes they'll give permission and sometimes they won't. So in a way, Amoskeag sort of still exists, but not in the same way that we think of it. So.
They own the land in the armory? Where the armory
Oh
is
yeah,
located?
yeah. Yes.
The company dictated the design of the buildings. That's why they all look so similar. There are variations, obviously, but they're all
Yeah.
red brick. Do those designs still exist?
The architectural
drawings.
plans, you mean?
Yeah, the drawings.
Yeah, there are I have seen Amoskeag architectural plans in the research center. Yeah, yes.
How many of the mills were redeveloped or rebuilt by Brady Sullivan?
Oh, by Brady Sullivan specifically, that I can't tell you specifically, but everything has been rehabilitated. What wasn't demolished back in the 60s and 70s, and even a little bit later, there are a couple of places here and there that were demolished, even in the 90s. But what was saved has been, redeveloped and restored and whatnot. So, but specifically by Brady Sullivan, I can't tell you exactly. But yes.
Has there ever been discussion about improving access to the interior of some of the mills? Here we can get in the basement of this mill, but you can't get onto what was originally a weaving floor or a spinning floor. And it would be so cool to be able to see the working area.
Yeah, the only thing there is that, imagine all these walls didn't exist at one time. If you want to see a gigantic spinning room, and you'd have to see that, or a weave room, you'd have to see it in old photographs. Most of these have been completely reconfigured. So you've got restaurants and you've got all kinds of buildings. Oh, by the way, another thing I forgot to mention, habitant Pisu. Right down, and there's a picture of that as well. In fact, I got an article that's going to be coming out in a Quebec City, it's in French though, Quebec City periodical, because one of my classmates, Bob Morin, his grandfather was one of the founders of that company. And so in Canada first, and then they came down here, and Bob's father, Gilles Morin, ran Habitant Pisu here from 1938 to 1938, that's just perfect time. The mills closed in 36, that building was closed, it was sold in 38, and they made soup there till 83.
Well, because I just toured one of our areas that we store things, and they actually have a can of the soup still there. So I was trying to think how old that soup is. Yeah.
If you buy this book, you can have a picture of the can. How's that? Well, I think I should close this because I think we'll be here all day if I keep asking questions. So, thank you.